I don't know where to start. I mean, the majority, if you guys want to look back in here, the majority of my notes from here to like right here in this line of right here, this is all Dennard Wilson. Like all this is Dennard Wilson. So
That's
I
exactly.
mean, he gave the most information. I do think that there was a lot of good tidbits with Brian, or with I'm just gonna call him Brian Holtz, right? Let's just call him Brian Holtz. Well, let's just relationship them together at this point, because they are one and the same at this juncture in time. But as far as Dennard Wilson goes, speaking of Rand Carthon and how everybody hates him because he doesn't, talk to you guys. The only reason Dennard Wilson is really here, it sounds like, is because of Rand Carthon.
Yep.
And if you read that very heavily opinionated piece by Gentry Estes, where he talks about, well, how could he be a people person? That's the first thing Brian Callahan said, and then boom, there you go. There's your people person. Exhibit A, people person. Rand Carthon, who has built great relationships, Dennard Wilson, a relationship that stood the test of time. That was not, they stayed in touch over time. They made plans almost talking about like, man, well, one day I'll be a defensive coordinator, a head coach, and you'll be a GM, back, I guess it would be 2008, which is now we're in 2024, which is just kind of crazy that, it took this long for these two guys to get together. But I mean, right there, I mean, there you go. There is your exhibit. There's your tangible evidence of Dennard Wilson or of Rand Carthon, his experience, people wanting to come here because of Rand. I mean, we had Aziz Al-Shair, Daniel Brunskill, Sean Murphy-Bunting as well. But this is your tangible evidence, like Dennard Wilson is here. He chose here because of Rand Carthon. I mean, that's what I got from the press conference.
I think it's funny. I wrote one of the things I wrote down because they talk so much about relationships and so much about overlap and working together. I mean, Brian Callahan and Dennard Wilson met like last week or whenever they interviewed, whenever that took place. That's when they met. Rand Carthon and Dennard Wilson met, as you pointed out, a very long time ago when they were both on the way up. So this, to me, I agree. The thing I took away from first, which again is not a huge talking point or big bullet point of it, but like ultimately this strikes me as a Rand Carthon decision with Brian Callahan's approval, not a Brian Callahan decision with Rand Carthon's approval. It's a small, subtle difference, but it very clearly is a Rand Carthon introduction. Hey, I want to introduce you to this guy that I know. Yes, you probably coached against him, and yes, you probably respect the Ravens secondary and all these things, but like I've known him for 15 years. You've never met. I want you guys to meet. Let's roll. Because they talk so much about experience and relationships and how much they all work together and being friends. And there's a lot of kumbaya at the press conference, but those two guys don't know each other, and they're going to learn to get to know each other.
And Brian Callahan even said in his opening remarks before even Dennard Wilson got up there is like how much, he leaned on Rand, how much Rand was an advocate for him to meet certain players, diversity of thought popped up as well in there.
Good one.
But he basically talked about Rand Carthon, people person, experience, Rolodex, this, and this. And that's called This is a collaboration, right? I mean, like, this is the pure definition of collaboration. Because when Rand Carthon was hired, I thought, well, for sure, they're going to interview some San Francisco guys that are on the way up for offensive coordinator. They're going to interview this or that guy for some defensive positions because he's got some connections. And they did none of that. So, like, this is pure collaboration. What then goes from there is that Brian Callahan, if you look at this staff, Dennard Wilson's staff, this is not a Brian Callahan staff. This is a Dennard Wilson staff. And I think someone tried to get them to say it, and it may have been PK again, tried to get them to say, like, is he the head coach of the defense? I don't know who that was, but
it was
someone
Steve
had said something like that. And I was like, that's kind of how I view this relationship, and that's how you should view the relationship between an offensive play calling head coach and a defensive coordinator, is that he comes in, he builds his staff. That's what you should do in this instance. You should not give a defensive coordinator as an offensive play calling head coach. Well, you're going to have to hire this guy, this guy, this guy. You let him build out his staff with people they trust, much like Brian Callahan has built out his staff with people they can trust. So I really like this staff. A lot of people have been asking me whether Tracy Rocker is a downgrade from Coach T. And I don't think so. If anything, that's just the same. If anything, it may be a marginal improvement. We'll just see. But what Tracy Rocker is known for, what Dennard Wilson preached in his thing, they're teachers. And that is what this whole staff, to me, Bill Callahan is considered one of the greatest teachers of the. They're not coaches, they are teachers. And I think with today's high school practices, high school technique teaching, college practices, college technique teaching, we talked about how like it takes offensive linemen really, they're not taught everything anymore. It's kind of like they're kind of rushed through, that you need teachers more than you need coaches. And that's kind of where I'm at. Also found it interesting that Brian Callahan mentioned Tom Jones at the top, said Tom Jones, him and Ren Carthon haven't really left the building. And Tom Jones was just announced that he got hired. So as assistant to the head coach, the new stretch, if you will. But I found that interesting as well.
I think going back to, and a couple of you guys have commented on this, and to your point about like, I think it was Steve Lehman that asked like, hey, were you looking for someone to be the head coach of the defense, for lack of a better phrase? And he kind of paused and he was like, I hadn't thought about it that way. But again, if you are the offensive play caller as the head coach, and we see this on every level of football, you are incapable of like going out, and we'll get into this in a minute, because very like, as to be expected, but more honest than Vrabel, of course, Callahan talking about when they actually make adjustments in a game. Well, it's going to be between series. Well, you can't do that with Will Levis and what other pieces of the offensive coaching staff you want on the sideline in between series. You can't do that and then also be out there calling the defensive plays and managing like you have to be able to delegate some of that, and delegating the defense to Dennard Wilson is clearly what he's decided. And in his answer, he said, look, I'll be here. I'm going to oversee this. I'm going to oversee that. I'm going to play the role of sounding board. If they need me to help with X, Y, or Z, I'm going to be here. Hey, this is really challenging for me as a coordinator. I'll be here. But like, I don't know. It struck me as Brian Callahan saying, look, this is his defense. This is his baby. He's going to run it how he sees fit. I'll be here if he needs me. And that's like from his mouth. That's not us guessing. That's from his mouth.
No, I mean, that's a definitive answer. It's something that we assumed, but it's a definitive answer. I think we got a lot of confirmation of stuff that we've talked about on the show. But what I thought was interesting was that both Brian Callahan and, of course, Dennard Wilson and stuff that he described talked about how in today's NFL, right? Like defenses in today's NFL, don't lock yourself into one thing, into one system, into one way of doing things. With the way the passing game has evolved, blah, 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 blah. If you've seen me talk or write or anything about Mike Macdonald, it just screams like you're getting Mike Macdonald without him being Mike Macdonald. Like that's what you're getting with Dennard Wilson. And something that nobody's really talked about is that he threw in there, he was talking about being smart with blitzes, right? You got to learn when to blitz, blah, blah. But he says, we're going to play man-to-man.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Nobody has talked about. Like, I have not seen anybody talk about. They're going to play man-to-man. So I don't know. In today's NFL, you don't play a lot of man anyway. But I'm pretty sure that you're going to be seeing a lot more man-to-man coverage, which means when you get to your prospect profile, when I'm building out and looking at draft picks and everything, he's talked about, let's see, where is it at? Attacking the ball, physical, violent ball skills, talent, effort, competitiveness, like all this stuff that has to do with being able to play man. Like everything that he listed out of what he's looking for in his coverage cornerbacks. First off, it eliminates Eric Garror and Trey Avery. But secondly, it says it's everything that you need to run a man-to-man coverage system. Foot speed, quickness, change of direction, leveraging your eyes. That's everything you need to have a good man-to-man corner. And this draft is really good and filled with man-to-man corners, in my opinion.
And his first sentence was like, I mean, again, when he's quoting, I don't know who he was quoting. It was the Patton quote or the other quote where he's like, look, nobody's defended anything really well. You got to attack.
That's Patton.
And, be violent. He said, he goes, he basically, to your point about the blitzing, he was like, blitz. And he goes, we will blitz when it's called for. We're going to be smart about it. We're going to play man to man. And then he immediately, of course, does the coach thing where he's like, also, we're going to be versatile and multiple and varied. And we're going to change looks and we got to change the picture and all that other stuff. Outstanding pass defense. I thought it was interesting that he was asked about, I think it's kind of a bad question. And I don't remember who asked it, so I apologize. I think it's kind of a bad question to ask about, like, how do you create turnovers? Because creating turnovers over time, generally kind of like recovering fumbles, for example, is a thing that regresses to a 50-50 proposition over time statistically. When balls are deflected in the air, there's a percentage that they get intercepted versus hit the ground that you regress to or progress to over time. But I thought his answer was interesting because he said the way you get to the foot, and he said, the football travels faster through the air than it does on the ground, and we have to you create turnovers through population and technique. I thought those were that's an interesting way to describe, which is essentially the same way every coach has said it forever. We're going to fly to the football. We've got to fly, right, but we're going to fly to the football with proper technique, which Fred Warner comes to mind.
Yeah, well, that also goes into, like, they want to be valid in their approach, which I thought was, like, basically our approach to defense is going to be we are doing what is right against this offense. We are going to be valid in approach, and they want to be smart and intelligent and not compromise. All this stuff. If you have not heard me talk about the Tennessee Titans defense ever since I've started football and other F words, and I know someone had put it up into the chat at some point, playing 10 yards off the ball is not going to happen. Like, it will happen sometimes, but this is going to be an in-your-face, violent defense, and that is what we are going to be looking for, right? That's what we've wanted. I don't know about blitzing. I don't give a shit about the run defense because run defense doesn't matter. Your run game and your run defense do not matter anymore if you're a Tennessee Titans fan. Like, it matters, like, right? Like, you don't want to, have someone going 200 yards on you. But at this point, if you look at the teams that make it to the playoffs, it is passing efficiency on offense and having really good pass defense. That's how you make the playoffs. And they're not going to make the playoffs next year. They're going to have a lot of work to do. Roger McCreary is physical and violent. He fits in really well. I would also say that when you look at it, like Jeffrey Simmons, obviously, Monty Hooker is going to be an interesting chess piece. We've kind of talked about him. I think he won't be Kyle Hamilton, but he could be Geno Stone-esque or something like that. Either way, they got a lot of work to do. And anybody that they bring in, and here's, I guess this kind of ties into this too. It's not about the scheme. Because, of course, PK's asked again about the 3-4-4-3 defense.
Did it in a better way, though, this time.
Yeah. But it's not about the scheme. It's about players, and you fit the scheme to what they do well. So you're going to be able to figure out what their scheme is by the players that they bring in. And you can guarantee they're not bringing in players to fit their scheme. They're bringing in players to create a scheme around. And to me, that is, again, a stark contrast to, I'm dating all the way back to Jeff Fisher, it feels like. I mean, it felt like this team for the longest time has been, I don't care if you're a square peg, you got to find your way to fit in this round hole.
Ironically, the guy who hired Dennard Wilson to give him his first coaching job. No, be multiple, flexible, adaptable. I mean, obviously all the other stuff, the tough, violent effort. He said he's going to teach, motivate, and inspire. Those last two are pretty much the same thing. I think we can, to your point, we're not going to know. Honestly, if anybody ever steps to the podium anymore as a defensive coordinator in 2024 and just says, like, here's how we're going to do it, I would be like taken aback by that. I'd be shocked. So I think everything he said is sort of what you have to say in a modern world where you have to be able to adapt on the fly, change your looks, change the picture for the opposing quarterback. You cannot be predictable on either side of the ball. Like, this is just sort of football. Like, it's just sort of football. So I don't think you can, like, win a lot of people over with these press conferences yesterday. I think, to your point about Nick Holtz, you can maybe lose a little bit of inspiration, but I don't think you can really win or lose much in yesterday. And I think Dennard Wilson kind of checked every box. He certainly has an alpha mentality and a personality that I think is on display in that ability to answer questions confidently. He sort of has his talking points ready to go. He sort of knows what he wants to say.
Billing, right? Like everything everybody talks about Dennard Wilson has been with the utmost respect, saying that he's going to be a future head coach. Like yesterday was a head coach press conference by Dennard Wilson. So
and the best
again, Rand Carthon had a really good press conference, and people hate him 1 year later. So maybe that people will hate Dennard Wilson, but I really think that Dennard Wilson, you sent the text that like, well, I didn't really find a lot of takeaways from a perspective of where I come looking at football, right? When I'm looking at the data, when I'm looking at, because you don't really analyze a lot of the draft prospects or anything, and that's not your thing. You watch a lot of college football, but you're not big into like creating big boards and draft prospect profiles.
Why do that when I've got your big
right
to work
exactly
on? Why do that?
But what I'm saying is, like, to me, I got a lot of information from Dennard Wilson in the sense of what they're looking for on defense, and not necessarily the scheme yet. But now we know that when they bring in a player, though, to me, that's a big takeaway. When they bring in a player, okay, well, let's look at what this player does really well, because that's how they're going to use them, right? I mean, it's not like, well, how will this player fit, in the way that the Tennessee Titans played defense in the last 4 years. Now it's like we're creating, both on offense and defense, we are creating something new, and we're all on the ground floor together to be able to figure out what this is. What does this look like? What is their idea? What's their vision? What's their philosophy? And it's going to be, it's not set in stone right now. There's a lot of assumptions you can make, but I felt like we got a lot of good insight from Wilson in that regard on the defense, and really to shift over to the offense. If you're okay with that.
Well, let me wrap up with the Wilson real fast, because I think you have to paint the entire picture before games happen. And the entire picture includes his background and track record, which we know has Todd Bowles. We know it has Greg Williams. We know it has these certain elements, right? We know what it's got. We saw him with McDaniel last year with Baltimore, so we can see what it was. We're going to see what players and what types of players they bring in. Just because they want to play man-to-man and they go try to acquire a bunch of man-to-man corners doesn't mean they end up with man-to-man corners that are good enough to run the system he wants to run. So maybe they have to adapt off of that. And then, of course, you just look at what happens once the games start, and the words that he says at the press conference. What I mean by, like, I didn't take a ton away is, like, it's just a piece of a puzzle. And I normally would view press conferences like this as sort of psychological experiments. I don't really view them as, like, unless there's a piece of information like Brian Callahan saying, I will be calling plays, there's a piece of like hardcore news that like changes the way the team works or whatever. I still think the pieces they go acquire in free agency and in the draft are going to tell us more about what he wants to do than what he told us, even though he told us what he wants to do, if that makes sense. Because I don't know a coach that steps up to the podium and is like, everybody has to do exactly what I tell them to do. Like, nobody says that shit. Every coach is like, oh, we're going to be multiple. We're going to fit the scheme around the player. We're going to play to their strengths. There's a lot of coach speak in there, other than when he gets down to like the nitty gritty. And we're going to get this with Callahan, because I thought there was moments of like really interesting nuggets there where, again, population and technique is about how you create turnovers. I've not heard someone say it like that. I think that's interesting. And otherwise, teach, motivate, inspire. That's kind of like coach speak 101. I do like the phrase obnoxious communication, because I think when you see a swarming defense that plays like violent, rabid football, you see every single player across the defense, especially the back seven, all communicate the same check at the same time when they see a certain motion or when they see a certain formation. What I like, when I see a defense that's playing on all cylinders, is when they come to the line of scrimmage and it's tight end motions to the other side and all six guys point. Like, that's the obnoxious communication. Again, a phrase I've not heard before, but I appreciate him using. So we'll see.
Hold on. Before we go, and move over to offense, fail to connect, fail to win. Sorry, I had this over in the little bit corner of my notebook over here. So fail to have a connection between all the players, of communicating, of a brotherhood and all this stuff, trust in each other on defense. You fail to win. And I thought, because we have seen over the years so many times where like you're just kind of, you see defenders blowing coverages, not trusting each other, looking at each other after a play, not understanding what's going on. But when you watch the Ravens play, you don't see that. You see that very few, much less.
Yep.
So in my mind, it's like and Mike McDonald said this, but when the Ravens are on defense and they see, let's say DeAndre Hopkins plays on the outside majority of times. When they see DeAndre Hopkins go into the slot, everybody without failure, without talking, they know where to go.
Yep.
They know where to change. They trust each other to make the adjustments necessary before the snap. So that means like if Kyle Hamilton was back in the back as a deep free safety and they see DeAndre Hopkins go into the slot, Kyle Hamilton may come into the slot to cover him while someone else goes back and takes his spot back there because they play the matchup. Just something I thought that tied something Mike McDonald talked about that tied in to failure to connect with each other, failure to win.
And he talked about keeping big plays, right? Pass plays in front of him, right? Like keeping everything in front of you, which again is about creating this sort of like not a cloud coverage, but it's about creating this no holes in the defense sort of style. So again, I think I think I learned more about his personality than any of his football stuff, and I think people should be excited about that type of personality because you need someone like Brian and a head coach to be on the defense if Brian is going to be calling the plays on the offense. So I think that's so far so good. No idea if any of this is going to work. I just caveat to every football decision ever made by every team ever. You just have people think they make every decision perfectly every time. You just never know.